As a debate teacher, as a debate coach, I have sinned because I have not focused enough on this one speaker role. The speaker role that goes missing sometimes, the speaker role that we don't teach enough, and it is the reply speaker. So I want to talk to you today about reply speeches and how to do a correct reply speech and the different varieties of the different types of reply speeches that there are. So let's get into it. The reason why reply speech is so hard to learn is because there are many different ways that you could structure a reply speech. The singular goal that you should have for your reply speech is a biased adjudication of why your side won the debate. So what does this mean? This means that you would be talking to the judge about why this debate would sway to your side. Also, you'd be addressing the strategic mistakes that the opposing team made that would also sway the debate to your side. So let's start with talking about why the other team lost the debate. At the beginning of every reply speech, the speaker should address any strategic issues or mistakes made by their opponents. Strategy is kind of like the lens through which judges will judge the debate. So here are some strategic issues that debaters can often address in the reply speech and at the beginning of the reply speech. Number one, you could say that the case development and the engagement by the other team was too late. This is what we call an op block. So what does this mean? This means that the other team must have brought out some constructive material or some refutations out in the third or the reply speech, but they didn't mention them enough in the first or second speech. In debate, you have to mention your constructive material early on, because if you don't do it early enough, then it can't be awarded by the judge. Of course, in the third speech, you can refute, reconstruct, reframe, all of this stuff, but you shouldn't be offering new material. So if the other team did do that, you can point this out and point out why the judge should not award this new material. Number two, you could point out the contradictions in your opponent's case. Another strategic mistake that your opposing team could make is they could contradict themselves in between different constructive material or even with their refutation. This is what happens when a team does not actually understand their burden, doesn't actually understand their stance. So contradictions involve reasoning that draws a conclusion from inconsistent and incompatible premises. So a very good example of a contradiction comes from the "this house would ban smoking" debate. So imagine if the opposing team had two arguments. The first argument being that people should have the agency and the freedom to choose whether to smoke or not. But for their second argument, they said that the smokers were addicted to smoking and thus they couldn't stop smoking anymore. These two arguments sound good individually. However, both of them cannot coexist because the opposition team cannot say that people should have the freedom to choose whether to smoke or not, but also say that people cannot choose because they are addicted. These two arguments contradict each other, and pointing out a contradiction such as this could be a way to win in the reply speech. So whenever you see contradictions, it is so important to point it out to the judge and give them a reason for them to rule the debate in your favor, and the beginning of the reply speech is a great place to do this. The third thing that you could point out is a lack of engagement from the opposing team on your constructive case. Sometimes teams get over-focused on their own arguments and they even forget to attack yours. So in such debates, it is useful for the reply speaker to point out that his or her arguments are remaining intact. However, you shouldn't just simply say, "they didn't refute us." That is not enough. There are two things that you have to do to make this point count. First, you need to ensure that your second or third speakers have brought up the lack of engagement and didn't simply just drop the argument. This is because when teams forget to re-mention their unrefuted arguments, these unrefuted arguments will be forgotten throughout the debate, even by the judge, and won't have a strong influence on the debate. So you need to have the second and third speaker restate the unrefuted arguments so that you as the reply speaker can carry that baton on forwards. But secondly, when you state that these arguments and this constructive material hasn't been attacked, you need to restate why these arguments or why this material was useful and important in the debate. So these are the three most strategic issues that I see most often brought up in a reply speech. One, you could point out that they had too late of case development in their case. 2, you could point out the contradictions that they had in their case. Or 3, you could point out that your constructive material wasn't actually attacked. Now let's go over some structures that people use often in their reply speech to organize the rest of the reply speech. There are 3 that comes to mind. 1, clashes. 2, actors, and 3, worlds. By the way, of these structures, I like the actors and the world structures a little bit more, mainly because the clashes structure is used by your third speaker. And especially if you're on the team of opposition, your third speaker has already spoken, so your reply speech, you don't want that reply speech to sound exactly like the third speaker's speech. So about clashes. If you don't know what a clash is basically an important issue that I usually like to phrase as a question that was stated in the debate. So basically, the proposition and the opposition, they believe in the opposite answers for these clashes. So for a clash like, is this motion justified? One side might say yes, while the other side says no. So the way that you would structure a reply speech using clashes is that you would say what the most important clashes were in the debate, and then you would state what each side said on the clash. You would go through clash number 1, what their team said about the clash, why it's wrong or irrelevant, what your team said about the clash, why it's right and relevant, and then clash number 2, what their team said about the clash, why it's wrong and irrelevant, and then what your team said and why it's right and relevant, and then you would do that for clash number 3 as well. Of course, if you're going to use a clash structure, as a reply speaker, you should probably signpost which clashes you're going to go over before you go over those clashes in detail. Reply speech structure number 2, actors. So for this structure, you would basically try to organize the debate into multiple actors, usually at least 2 or 3. So for example, you would talk about actor number 1, right? And then you would talk about what their team does to that actor, and then why, and then what your team does for that actor and why, right? And then you would talk about actor number 2, what their team does and why, and what your team does and why. Of course, when you're talking about what your team does versus what their team does for the actor, you would want to talk about how their team doesn't give the actor what they need and what they want, and you would talk about why your team does give what the actor needs and wants to the actor. Wait, that was weird. That your team gives to the actor what they need and want. Yes. So you're fulfilling the needs and wants of the actor, whereas the other team is not. So in that way, you're trying to prove that your team creates more prosperity and happiness for each of those actor groups. Right? So stakeholder number 1, 2, and 3, because you give them a better life, you give them a better world, therefore you deserve to win the debate. So that's the structure, the actor structure for the reply speech. The third way that you could do this is with worlds. So usually in debate, you are comparing the counterfactual to the status quo. So the reply speaker, depending on whether they like the status quo or the counterfactual more, basically they would talk about the other team's world versus your team's world, whichever one you like more. So you would break it up into 2 or 3 different aspects of these worlds, and you would compare it on what the opposing side said and what your team said. So of course, you would say what their team said about an aspect of the world, and then what your team said about an aspect of the world, and you go back and forth for those 2 to 3 different aspects, be it economics, culture, happiness, freedom, things like that. But basically all you're doing is, instead of talking about actors, instead of talking about clashes, you're organizing the debate into the status quo versus the counterfactual, depending on whichever one you like better. So those are the organizational structures for the reply speech, but let me leave you with some organizational tips. 1, make sure to differentiate yourself from your third speaker. If you are a reply speaker, you need to sound different than your third. Especially if you are on the opposition side, because the op third speaker speaks right before the op reply speaker. So the reply speaker isn't just regurgitating what the third speaker had just said. The reply speaker is framing the debate in the way that it needs to be framed and telling the judge why they deserve to win. it. And note, as a reply speaker, you don't have to talk about every single thing that happened in the debate. And very often, you don't even have the time to do so. So just organize the debate in a way that is easy to understand for the judge and why you win the debate. Number 2, focus on the clashes and the analysis that actually won you the debate. Focus on the important stuff. Reply speeches are short, so you really need to be efficient with your time. And then tip number 3, focus on your style. Highly emotive replies are the best replies, and they set up an atmosphere where the judge will take later to judge the round. It's really good to differentiate your reply speaker style from the style of the other speakers on your team, especially from the third. So if the third speaker was bombastic, fast, and loud, then as a reply speaker, maybe you want to be cool, calm, and collected. Very often, I think reply speakers work better in just a calmer style. So yeah, I hope I've given you enough to understand how to make a reply speech and what a reply speaker should do. There's a lot of different styles and different organizational structures that you can use for a reply speech, but just choose one of those and practice it and get good at it, okay? So yeah, that's all from me about reply speeches. I hope today has been useful, and if you have any questions about reply speeches, you can just ask them in the chat. See you later!